This program demonstrates the procedures for the removal and installation of line replaceable units related to the engine sensors. These include the N1 speed sensor, the N2 speed sensor, the T12 inlet temperature sensor, the TP25 compressor inlet temperature and pressure sensor, the T3 temperature sensor, the turbine clearance control temperature sensor, the T49.5 exhaust gas temperature sensor, the T5 temperature sensor, the WB3 bleed bias sensor, and the compressor case forward flange vibration sensor. N1 speed sensor removal and installation. The N1 speed sensor is housed within the fan frame and is visible at the 4 o'clock position, aft looking forward. Removal. Loosen the coupling rings of the 3 electrical connectors and disconnect the electrical cables from the N1 speed sensor. Remove the 2 bolts which attach the sensor to its mounting plate on the fan frame. Slowly and carefully pull the sensor straight out of its guide tube. Use a container to catch any oil which may have accumulated in the guide tube. Remove and discard the O-ring from the guide tube extremity. Installation. Install a new lubricated O-ring on the guide tube end. Align the sensor probe with the guide tube. Engage the probe in the tube and push it slowly. Be careful to keep the alignment and push with a smooth movement until you feel the probe come to a stop. At this point of the installation, the probe is fully engaged by hand and in a free state. Measure the gap between the sensor mounting flange and the mounting plate. The gap must be within the limits indicated in the maintenance manual. If the gap is not within the limits, remove the sensor and determine the cause. When tightening the bolts, tighten each bolt sequentially in increments to prevent distortion of the sensor body. Final torque should be applied equally and at the same time. Reconnect the electrical connectors. This completes the demonstration of the removal and installation procedures for the N1 speed sensor. N2 speed sensor, removal and installation. The N2 speed sensor is mounted on the rear face of the AGB at the 6 o'clock position, aft looking forward. Removal. Disconnect the electrical connectors from the N2 speed sensor. Remove the 2 bolts which attach the sensor to the AGB. Remove the sensor from its recess. Remove and discard the O-ring. Installation. Install a new lubricated O-ring on the sensor. Carefully engage the sensor into the AGB. Secure the sensor with the bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Reconnect the electrical connectors to the sensor. This completes the removal and installation procedures for the N2 speed sensor. Fan inlet temperature sensor, removal and installation. The fan inlet temperature, or T12 sensor, is mounted on the intake cowl upstream of the fan at the 1 o'clock position, aft looking forward. Removal. Disconnect the engine electrical harness from the sensor connectors. Disconnect the bonding strap from the ground stud. Loosen and remove the 4 mounting bolts and washers. Pull the T12 sensor out of the inlet cowl. Installation. Position the T12 sensor on the air inlet cowl. Secure it with the 4 bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Engage the bonding strap on the ground stud and secure it with a nut and washer. Tighten and torque the nut. Connect the engine electrical harness to the 2 sensor connectors. This concludes the removal and installation procedures for the fan inlet temperature sensor. Compressor inlet temperature and pressure sensor. Removal and installation. The compressor inlet temperature and pressure, or TP25 sensor, is mounted within the fan frame mid-box structure, just below the 9 o'clock position, aft looking forward. Removal. Remove the fan duct panel located below the 9 o'clock fan frame strut. Disconnect the engine harness from the sensor electrical connectors. Disconnect the pressure tube from the sensor nipple. Loosen and remove the nuts securing the 2 connectors to the bracket assembly. Loosen and remove the nut securing the nipple to the bracket assembly. Loosen and remove the 2 bolts securing the bracket assembly to the fan frame. Remove the 2 retaining brackets. Then push the electrical connectors inside the fan frame. On the sensor, loosen the captive bolt of the pressure tube. Disengage the pressure tube from the sensor port and remove it. Remove and discard the O-ring. Loosen the 3 captive bolts that attach the sensor to the fan frame. Remove the sensor. Installation. Position the sensor within the fan frame and secure it with the 3 captive bolts. Tighten and torque the bolts. Install a new lubricated O-ring on the sensor pressure tube. Position the pressure tube within the fan frame and engage it into the sensor port. Secure it with a captive bolt. Tighten and torque the bolt. Position the 2 electrical connectors through the fan frame holes. Install the 2 retaining brackets and secure them with the 2 bolts. Tighten and torque the bolts. Attach the air tube nipple to the bracket assembly with a nut. Then the 2 electrical connectors. Tighten and torque the nuts. Connect the P25 tube to the nipple. Tighten and torque the coupling nut. Connect the engine harness to the two electrical connectors. Reinstall the fan duct panel. This concludes the removal and installation procedure of the TP25 sensor. T3 temperature sensor, removal and installation. The T3 temperature sensor is mounted on the compressor case at the 12 o'clock position. Removal. Disconnect the two electrical connectors from the sensor. Remove the 4 bolts that attach the probe to the combustor case. Remove the bolt, nut, and washer from the mid-conduit bracket. Remove the bolts and nuts which attach the T3 output connector assembly to the forward bracket. Pull out the sensor from the combustor case. Remove the gasket from between the probe and the combustor case and discard it. Remove the sensor by sliding it out from under the engine electrical harness. Installation. Position a new gasket on the combustor case. Install the T3 probe into the port and its output connector unit close to the supporting bracket. Secure the probe onto the combustor case with the 4 bolts and washers. Tighten and torque the bolts. Attach the sensor output connector unit to the bracket with the bolts and nuts. Tighten and torque the bolts. Attach the mid-conduit bracket with the bolt, washer, and nut. Tighten and torque the nut. Reconnect the electrical connectors to the sensor. This completes the demonstration of the removal and installation procedures for the T3 temperature sensor. Turbine clearance control temperature sensor, removal and installation. The engine is equipped with 2 turbine clearance control, or TCC, temperature sensors, mounted on the combustor case at the 3 and 9 o'clock positions. Removal. To remove one TCC sensor, first disconnect the electrical connector. Remove the bolts and washers that attach the sensor to the combustor case. Remove the sensor and the gasket. Discard the gasket. Installation. Install a new gasket on the TCC sensor. The small tip of the sensor must fit into a hole on the HPT shroud support. Failure to engage the TCC sensor into the shroud support will result in damage to it. Pointing the electrical connector of the TCC forward, position it with the gasket on the combustor case. Do not install the attachment bolts yet. Check the correct installation of the sensor by measuring the gap between the flange of the sensor and the surface of the case. The gap must be within the limits indicated by the maintenance manual. If the gap is out of the limit, apply a light pressure to the sensor and turn it so that the probe will engage correctly in the shroud support and measure the gap again. Install the lubricated bolts and washers and secure the sensor. Connect the electrical connector to the sensor. This completes the removal and installation procedures of the TCC sensor. Exhaust gas temperature sensor, removal and installation. The exhaust gas temperature sensor, or EGT sensor, also called T49.5 sensor, is a series of 9 probes attached all around the low-pressure turbine to the case, just behind the axial flow bulkhead. For this demonstration, only one harness featuring two probes will be removed. Removal. Disconnect the flexible electrical harness from the EGT probe's junction box. Then remove the vent tube of each probe. Disconnect the inlet extremity of the tube by removing the two bolts securing it onto the collector mounting flanges. Disengage the vent tube from the axial flow bulkhead passage. First, remove the bolt and nut that secures the two collector halves together. Remove the nut that holds one collector half to the combustor case stud and remove the collector half. Then remove the nut and the second collector half. Repeat the process for the second probe. Loosen and remove the bolts securing the EGT probe's junction box to the mounting bracket. Carefully disengage the probes from their recesses and remove the harness. Installation. Position the assembly on the case. Engage the probes in their recesses and the retaining plates onto the studs. Using the nuts, first secure one of the collector halves to the combustor case. Then secure the second half. Tighten and torque the nuts. Secure the two halves to each other using the bolt and nut. Tighten and torque the bolt. Repeat the process for the second probe. Engage the vent tube outlet into the bulkhead passage and secure its inlet onto the collector with the two bolts and nuts. Tighten and torque the nuts. Do the same with the second vent tube on the second probe. Secure the probe's junction box onto the supporting bracket with the two bolts, nuts, and washers. Reconnect the flexible electrical harness to the probe's junction box connector. This concludes the removal and installation procedures for the exhaust gas temperature sensor. T5 temperature sensor, removal and installation. T5 is an optional temperature sensor mounted on the turbine rear frame at the 3 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. First, disconnect the electrical harness from the T5 output connector. Detach the rectangular bracket of the T5 output connector assembly by removing the two nuts and bolts securing it to the adjacent bent bracket. Remove the two nuts and bolts attaching the T5 probe to the turbine rear frame boss. Detach the three brackets holding the T5 rigid lead along the low-pressure turbine case. Carefully remove the T5 sensor assembly from the engine. Installation. Position the T5 sensor along the low-pressure turbine case. Engage the probe into the turbine rear frame boss recess. Install the bolts and nuts and tighten them by hand. Attach the three clamps of the T5 rigid lead with the bolts and nuts. Tighten them by hand. Secure the rectangular bracket pre-assembled to the T5 output connector onto the bent bracket with the two bolts and nuts. tighten them by hand. After making sure the T5 rigid lead is installed stress-free, torque all the bolts and nuts from rear to front. Once again, ensure that the installed assembly is free of stress. Finally, connect the electrical harness to the T5 output connector. This completes the removal and installation procedures for the T5 temperature sensor. Bleed bias transducers, removal and installation. The bleed bias, or WB3 transducers, are mounted on a bracket attached to the compressor front case at the 10 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Disconnect the two electrical connectors from the transducers. Remove the clamps that attach the static and the total air pressure tubes. Disconnect the pressure tubes from the transducers. Remove the 4 bolts and washers attaching the WB3 transducers. Pull out the transducers. Installation. Position the WB3 transducers onto the attachment bracket. Install and hand tighten the 4 bolts. Do not torque them at this time. Install the clamps holding the pressure tubes and secure them with the bolt, washer, and nut. Do not torque the nuts at this time. Connect the 2 pressure tubes to the transducers and tighten their B-nuts by hand. Now tighten and torque the transducer bolts, the clamp nut, and the pressure tube B-nuts. Reinstall the 2 electrical connectors. This completes the demonstration of the removal and installation procedures for the bleed bias transducers. Compressor case forward flange vibration sensor. Removal and installation. The compressor case forward flange, or CCFF vibration sensor, is mounted at the 3 o'clock position aft looking forward. Removal. Disconnect the engine harness from the vibration sensor electrical connector. Remove the 2 clamps holding the sensor harness on the case. Loosen and remove the 2 bolts securing the sensor. Loosen and remove the nut securing the sensor electrical connector onto the 6 o'clock junction box. Remove the sensor. Remove and discard the O-ring. Installation. Fit the vibration sensor connector with a new O-ring. Position the sensor on the case and attach the connector with the nut. Tighten and torque the nut. Secure the sensor onto the case flange with the 2 bolts. Tighten and torque the bolts. Attach the clamps holding the sensor lead along the case. Reconnect the harness to the sensor electrical connector. This concludes the removal and installation procedures for the CCFF vibration sensor.